Hello everyone, I'm Joy Holt and thanks for joining us for this special edition of In.form. I'm joined here today with Todd Hitchcock, the Assistant Superintendent at the Greater Jasper Consolidated Schools. Hey Todd.
Hey.
Thank you for being with us first.
Thank you for having me.
So we've got you on here today to talk about standardized testing, everyone's favorite subject, I'm sure.
Yes.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Not really.
So what I want to talk about today is they are moving from iStep to iLearn coming up. Can you give us a broad overview of what standardized testing is and what it means to the school?
Okay. So standardized testing takes place in all education in Indiana. We start testing in 3rd grade and test students every year up until their 8th grade year, and then we test again in 10th. And the purpose for that is to measure growth over time. The state wants to have some way to measure that schools are indeed educating children, and it's a good way for schools to track and measure how students are growing from year to year. So that's why we have it, and that's how we go about ensuring that we're providing that education for students.
Okay, is standardized testing mandated?
Yes, it is. Yes,
Okay.
It's required by state statute that all students in grades 3 through 8 participate.
Okay, and because it is mandated, what is the purpose? What purpose does it serve? Is there funding tied to this?
No, not funding. In recent years, what we've started to do is we assess schools with a letter grade. And so you may see that this school's rated an A or this school's rated a B or whatever the school is. That's determined based on performance by students and growth. So you get 2 scores, each school does. You get a score that says 80% of your students passed, but even for the students who didn't pass, they did show a minimum of a year's growth, which is what you want. And so then they have a formula where they factor those 2 together, and that determines your school letter grade. So the test impacts schools in that a letter grade is derived based on the performance and growth seen on the assessment each year.
Okay, and so how important is the letter grade?
Well, to some people it's very important. To others, and the way I like to view it is one tool that we have to measure all the things we do. What we don't want to do is to say we're a great school because of our performance on this test, but at the same time we don't want to say we're a bad school because of our performance on this test. The way I view it and the way our school board views it is that this is one way we evaluate the things we do. There are many programs and activities and things that go on in our classrooms on a daily basis that aren't evaluated through a test. And we recognize that, and I feel like our community recognizes that as well. And so even in school districts where you may see good school letter grades, it's also important to know everything else that goes in to a well-rounded education. Okay,
so from your perspective, can you tell me some of the pros and cons of standardized testing that you face sometimes?
Well, a pro is it is one data point. It is one way to measure student performance, and it's a good way to compare your student performance to performances of students in other schools and across the state. So that's the pro, in my opinion, and it is designed by educators and matches our standards, our academic standards that we teach to. The con is we, as a state, I think sometimes we place too great an emphasis on the test, and we make it more important than it needs to be. And also, there is some question from time to time as to whether the test is really assessing the things that we think are the most important. And if they're not, then we don't want to, place that big emphasis on it. We'd rather emphasize other things. So,
all right. So let's talk about some of the categories on the test. What are the main categories that students are tested in, their abilities?
So there's 4 subject areas. They're tests in like an English language arts, math, science, and social studies. Those are the 4 content areas that are assessed in the state of Indiana.
Are they weighted with like math being most important, English next?
They're not weighted. I will say that they are tested more frequently in English and math. They're tested in English and math every year from grades 3 through 8 and grade 10. They are only tested in science and social studies 2 times each. So they'll have a science and social studies, science twice and social studies twice throughout that grade span.
Okay, so let's talk about how the test is changing, because it is coming up to it's going to switch over to the iLearn, which is a new format.
Yes.
And I know they were talking about computer smart questions, like how it would change. Could you tell us a little bit about what iLearn is and how that is going to impact the new test?
So yes, iLearn is computer adaptive, but I think maybe the best thing to do would be to start with what's the same. So here's what you'll see that's the same. It's still going to test math, English, science, and social studies. And it's still going to test over the same academic standards that it always has. The difference, and I think you mentioned the biggest difference to start with, is it will be computer adaptive. And so what that means is that if you and I were taking this, sitting next to each other and taking the same test, if the first question was 3 plus 3, and you got it right and I got it wrong, then you're going to move on to a more difficult line of questioning, whereas I may get another question similar because the test wants to make sure that that wasn't a fluke that I missed it, or is that really the level I'm at? So the hope through that computer adaptive approach is that you get a more accurate level of what a student really knows, because they will have had ample opportunity to prove their mastery on a certain standard instead of just getting that standard one time and then maybe they get it right, maybe they guessed and got it right, or maybe they just circled the wrong one on accident. So we hope that through the computer adaptive we get a more accurate reading as to what a student really knows for each standard.
Okay, and have the students already been taking the standardized test on the computers for a couple years now?
The standardized test has been, we've taken parts of it on the computer for the last, I want to say, 3 years. So online testing for part of the iStep is required, but for part of it, it is not. And so many schools will do paper pencil for part 1, and they'll do online testing for part 2. One of the changes with iLearn is that there will no longer be 2 parts. There will be 1 assessment window, and it will be later in the school year. So there will no longer be a part 1 of iStep that takes place in early March, and then again in May. It'll all be in that late April, May time period.
So the end of the year, when everyone's excited for leaving, do you think this will like make a difference? Kids will be like, all right, it's our last big thing.
Yeah, I think it'll be, I hope. Let's put it this way. The teachers, I know, are going to appreciate having 1 testing window later because they feel like it'll be a more valuable assessment because they won't have 2 months left after the first part of the assessment where they aren't sure if they got to everything that was on it. I think they'll have a greater chance of teaching everything they want to teach prior to the assessment. So I think that's good. There's also a deadline that's been passed with the new iLearn that all the reports will be returned to schools by July 1st. And so that's new, and I think a good thing because it will allow schools to actually do something with the data. So if we determine that the data is valuable and we want to use that to help guide placement for students or maybe scheduling of classes if students need remediation or enrichment or whatever, we'll be able to do that if we have that data by July 1st, as opposed to in some years past, the scrutiny has been that we haven't got that till September or October even, which is too late to do anything for that school year.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for sitting with us
Thank you for
and
having me.
giving us an overview. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. That's been In Form. I'm Joy Holt.